What if the biggest mistake you could make about retirement isn't saving too little, but trusting that the rules you learned decades ago still exist today? What if the system didn't fail you suddenly, but slowly rewrote itself while you were busy doing everything right? And what if the reason most people never panic is because panic would mean realizing how little control they actually have left? For most of your working life, retirement is presented as something stable, a fixed destination, a reward that waits patiently at the end of discipline. Work, save, delay, repeat. The promise is simple: consistency will be enough, but systems don't stay still for decades. They evolve, they adapt. And most importantly, they optimize for their own survival, not for your expectations. There was no announcement when the structure began to change. No moment where anyone stood up and said, "From now on, retirement will feel different." Because change doesn't need drama when it has time. Instead, the shifts came quietly. Contribution limits adjusted, tax rules reinterpreted, benefit calculations softened, inflation assumptions updated. Each change made sense on its own. None of them demanded attention. None of them felt personal. And that is how systems protect themselves. For decades, people were taught that responsibility was the solution. If something went wrong, it must have been a personal failure. Saved too little, started too late, chose the wrong options. That belief is powerful because it keeps the focus inward. It discourages structural questions. It replaces anger with guilt. So when the numbers stop feeling liberating, most people don't question the framework. They question themselves. They run projections again. They adjust expectations. They redefine what enough means. And slowly, freedom turns into stability. Stability turns into limitation. Limitation turns into acceptance. What almost no one notices is that this transition isn't accidental. Modern financial systems are not designed to maximize independence. They are designed to minimize volatility. Volatility is dangerous for systems. It creates unpredictability. Unpredictability forces change. Calm, on the other hand, is manageable. Calm workers contribute steadily. Calm savers don't disrupt flows. Calm retirees adapt quietly. That's why the language around retirement is always reassuring. Security, protection, stability. These words sound like safety, but they also describe boundaries. They define how far you're expected to move and how much uncertainty you're allowed to tolerate. Look closely at the default options most people are given. Automatic enrollment, suggested contribution rates, target date structures labeled with comforting timelines. All of it helpful, all of it reasonable, but also all of it directional. Choice still exists, technically. But framed choices guide behavior more effectively than force ever could. And once behavior becomes predictable, systems can plan around it. This is why retirement rarely collapses in dramatic ways. It doesn't need to. Collapse attracts attention. Normalization does not. Instead, the system narrows outcomes gradually. Taxes don't jump, they creep. Benefits don't vanish, they dilute. Inflation doesn't shock, it erodes. Over time, these forces create a corridor. You can still move forward. You can still step back. But the walls close in slowly enough that most people adjust without realizing they're adjusting. Adaptation feels like maturity. Acceptance feels like wisdom. That's why conversations around retirement often sound strangely calm, even when the numbers are tight. "I thought I'd have more. It's not what I expected. I guess this is just how things are now." These aren't expressions of anger. They're expressions of resignation. And resignation is incredibly useful to systems, because when people believe outcomes are inevitable, they stop resisting. They stop questioning assumptions. They stop imagining alternatives. Complexity plays a key role here. Retirement systems are layered with rules, exceptions, timelines, and thresholds that only make sense if you track them for decades. You can learn them, but learning them requires time, energy, and consistency that most people simply don't have. Complexity doesn't eliminate resistance. It exhausts it. By the time most people fully understand what's happening, changing course becomes expensive. Penalties, taxes, lost compounding. Exiting the system late is always more costly than entering it early. That's why the most fragile moment isn't retirement itself. It's the years just before it. The moment when people are heavily invested, emotionally and financially, aware enough to sense something is off, but too committed to walk away without consequences. That's when calm becomes most important. Desperation creates noise. Noise attracts scrutiny. Scrutiny invites reform. Calm preserves order. Responsibility is emphasized constantly, but power is rarely discussed. You're responsible for saving, responsible for planning, responsible for adjusting expectations, but rarely empowered to influence the structures shaping those outcomes. Responsibility without agency is not freedom, it's management, and management always serves a goal. Retirement in this context is less an endpoint and more a transition, a handoff from personal control to institutional oversight, from flexibility to dependence, not dramatic dependence, quiet dependence. Dependence on rules you didn't write, timelines you didn't choose, assumptions that may no longer reflect reality. Once inside that phase, leaving becomes harder each year. The corridor narrows further. Options become theoretical rather than practical. Most people respond by adjusting internally rather than externally. They downsize expectations. They redefine comfort. They practice gratitude. And gratitude is healthy. But gratitude can coexist with loss, especially when that loss is gradual and socially normalized. The system doesn't need enthusiasm. It needs compliance, predictable behavior, low variance. That's when the final realization emerges. The system didn't break. It didn't malfunction. It didn't betray anyone. It performed exactly as designed. It's smooth, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because the most powerful systems don't rely on force. They rely on habit, on routine, on the quiet agreement that tomorrow will look close enough to today. That belief is comforting. It allows people to plan, to sleep, to trust that patience will be rewarded eventually. But patience only works when the destination stays still. When the endpoint keeps moving, patience turns into delay. Delay turns into dependence. And dependence is never announced. It's introduced slowly, wrapped in reassurance. That's why so many people reach retirement without anger. Anger requires a clear moment of loss. What they experience instead is ambiguity. Nothing is gone all at once. Nothing feels stolen. Everything is technically intact. And yet something essential is missing. The sense of control. The feeling that decisions still belong to you. The freedom to adapt without penalty. What remains is management, rules, timelines, acceptable ranges. And most people comply not because they're weak, but because resistance is expensive, emotionally, financially, socially. So they adjust inward, they redefine success. They tell themselves that stability is enough. And for many, it is. But stability is not the same as freedom. And calm is not the same as consent. The system does not need you to panic. It does not need you to rebel. It only needs you to stay calm. Calm enough to keep contributing. Calm enough to keep adapting. Calm enough to never ask when the rules changed. Because the moment people stop being calm, they start paying attention. And attention is the one thing systems cannot fully control. This is not a call to fear. It's not a call to action. It's not a warning meant to provoke panic. It's an invitation to notice. To notice the difference between protection and limitation, between security and containment, between stability that serves you and stability. By the time most people sense that something has shifted, the cost of reacting is already higher than the cost of staying still. That is not an accident. Systems mature by narrowing exit points, not by closing them outright. They leave doors technically open, but place them behind penalties, delays, and psychological fatigue. Choice still exists, but it becomes increasingly theoretical. This is why retirement rarely feels like a moment of clarity. There is no clear before and after. There is only adjustment, a smaller expectation here, a delayed decision there, a quiet compromise that feels reasonable in isolation. Over time, these compromises accumulate into a life that is stable, functional, and carefully managed, but no longer fully owned. What makes this especially effective is that nothing looks broken. The paperwork still arrives. The accounts still update. The projections still function. Everything appears intact. Yet the relationship between effort and outcome quietly weakens. Not enough to trigger alarm, but enough to dull ambition. Enough to make people grateful for predictability rather than hopeful for autonomy. At this stage, the system no longer needs to persuade. It simply maintains momentum. People continue forward because reversing direction feels impractical. They have adapted their identity to the structure. They have learned to think in terms of limits rather than possibilities. And most importantly, they have internalized the belief that stability itself is the reward. But stability is not neutral. It always serves a purpose. And the purpose of stability within large financial systems is not individual fulfillment, but continuity. Continuity of cash flow, continuity of behavior, continuity of expectations. Systems do not optimize for happiness or freedom. They optimize for reliability. This is why volatility is treated as a threat. Not just market volatility, but emotional and behavioral volatility. Sudden changes in behavior create pressure. Pressure invites scrutiny. Scrutiny leads to reform. And reform introduces uncertainty. Calm prevents all of that. Calm people stay within the lines. Calm people accept trade-offs without asking who benefits. Calm people mistake predictability for safety and safety for fairness. Over time, calm becomes a moral virtue rather than a behavioral state. People are praised for being reasonable, patient, realistic, and realism slowly replaces imagination. The danger here is not poverty. The danger is reduction, a life compressed into acceptable ranges, a future shaped more by institutional tolerance than personal intent. People do not lose everything. They lose optionality. They lose the ability to move freely across time, money, and decision-making without friction. By the time retirement arrives, many people are not disappointed. They are simply quieter, less curious, less willing to challenge assumptions. They have learned that deviation carries cost, while compliance carries comfort. And comfort, when offered consistently, is difficult to refuse. This does not mean the system is evil. It means it is indifferent. Indifferent to individual meaning. Indifferent to personal narrative. Indifferent to whether stability feels like fulfillment or containment. Systems measure success in continuity, not consciousness. And yet, awareness changes the equation. The moment you recognize that calm is not always chosen, that sometimes it is cultivated, you regain something important. Not control, necessarily, but perspective. You begin to see which parts of your life are managed and which are still authored. You notice when security serves you and when it simply keeps you in place. This is not about rejecting stability. It is about understanding its cost. About knowing when protection becomes limitation, when structure becomes substitute, when patience stops being a virtue and starts becoming a delay tactic. Retirement in this light is not a finish line. It is a mirror. It reflects how much agency you were able to preserve while moving through systems designed to absorb it. Some people will find peace there. Others will find constraint. Neither outcome is accidental. The most important thing to understand is that the system does not need your enthusiasm. It only needs your calm participation. It does not ask you to believe. It only asks you to continue. And continuation, when unexamined, becomes surrender. This is not a warning. It is not advice. It is not a call to action. It is a reminder that the most consequential changes rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, wrapped in reason, justified by complexity, and protected by comfort. The question is not whether the system works. The question is whether, within it, you are still choosing or simply being stabilized.